Hello, my name is Ron Bettag. This is the Saturday, August the 5th discussion on by the Schiller Institute and LaRouche's policies. I think, I don't know if people have had a chance to see Helga's address on the website last night. It's about a half-an-hour discussion of the immediate crisis we face, because we are really in a world historic situation that really requires the American people to now come onto the stage of history. And what she lays out is the fact that we have had an election in the United States, and that election, which was voted for by the population and in the direction by this candidate to reflect the policy that would change the dynamic away from this British zero growth policy, regime change, and come back to a dedication to the general welfare. And what you have even before Trump's election is what's more and more clear for people, a fully integrated, mobilized operation to wreck that. Whether you're looking at the media operation, you're looking at the intelligence operations, just the general playing of the dumbing down of the population, but a clear orchestration for war, for confrontation, as we had under Obama and as we had under Cheney. And so we've had a few breakthroughs on that. The fact that this VIPs, this veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, who have been on the scene for a while, they were actually key players in countering some of the policies under Cheney and others, or at least attempting to, on this move against Iraq, that there were weapons of mass destruction. They were making up this intelligence through people like Tony Blair and others. And what Lynn and Helga have both said in the last period, but really all along, is that the only way you can understand this and actually put together a competent solution is, one, fight the actual enemy. You know, it's being referred to as secret government, deep state, whatever, but it's really a clear understanding of this old Anglo-Dutch empire that runs on a policy of loot, population reduction, controlled by geopolitics. And that is the subject that has to be now picked up by intelligence layers, like are beginning to move, by political parties and other forces institutionally, and by single individuals who help break this thing, VIPs reports and everything public. And so those mobilizations we can talk about a little bit also in the discussion period. We have a petition to actually create a situation with these players like Ray McGovern, Binney, these various individuals who led this investigation, where they put together this forensic report that actually takes the computers of the Democrats and finally goes through that, something the FBI and others did not do. And they basically prove, generally in an overview, that you cannot get that amount of material in that amount of time, less than 90 seconds, in any form in terms of a hack or through emails or whatever. It had to be a physical device on the scene, like a stick or whatever, that was downloaded and then leaked in that form. And that's what the WikiLeaks layers have been laying out since the beginning. But now it's proven publicly that there was no hack, could not have been a hack physically. Obviously, therefore, there wasn't a Russian hack as well. And part of this overall dynamic to break return to an American system is this attempt to pull a coup and even assassination in the United States. And if we can get these individuals, force a testimony on these guys, we're in a position to break this thing, as LaRouche uniquely has been breaking it for the last 30, 40 years. So we can go through more of that in the questions and answers, but in terms of actually getting to this situation where you look at the vote in the Congress, even though this is public, granted the fact that many of them didn't know about it in terms of the bubble that's maintained, but Congress, the Senate and the House both voted almost unanimously to increase sanctions anyway. Now, as Helga lays out in her discussion, this is really a constitutional crisis. It's the manipulation of Congress to take that kind of power that's relegated to the president, the setting of foreign policies. They're beginning to move to break the actual division of labor in the three levels of government. So it is a coup against the United States by these outside powers. And the real collusion that's gone on is not from the Russians, it's from this deeper British operation. Now, and Lynn's been laying this out for years, and we hear it, and to get a sense of how this works, I wanted to take an example of the Eisenhower-Adams for Peace program, where first Roosevelt comes out of the war with a commitment to development nationwide, use Russia and China and the United States as the alliance to deliver this kind of development for the world. That's immediately sabotaged with his death. You know, Truman goes the opposite direction. There's these internal battles people know different things about, but you have then Eisenhower brought in and basically is against the kind of policies that are already being run with the Trumans, the increase on these strategic dangers that are being, you know, there's all these reasons why we've got to have a military increase of the budget. You know, it builds into the Korean War situations, but they get these doubling and triplings of the military budget. Now, Eisenhower comes in, he's opposed to that, he sees no reason for it. He actually is more of the Roosevelt bent in what they fought for to bring out of World War II, that you actually can deal with that with what we already had, an adequate defense, but tie it to economic development. And so what I wanted to do is look at both that direction the nation was going in with Eisenhower, Adams for Peace, and this development, but look at some of the operations that were already in place by the British that actually had financed the Hitler operation and the population reduction. But you have this operation in place that basically sabotaged that. And you have people, again, like today, playing both sides. You have the Scoop Jacksons on the Democrat side coming out of the Russellite networks, you know, Committee for Present Danger, all these kinds of operations. You have then, you know, Eisenhower's Adams for Peace program, just to state it briefly, was committed to building 1,000 nuclear power plants for the United States and 1,500 for export internationally. The basis of actually pulling this Russia, China, United States alliance for a new American system. And that's specifically what the British had been moving, even with the creation of the wars, to block. Now, so this is moving. You have people, you know, I'm just going to introduce these people because I think Lynn, in the best manner, actually goes after this question of the networks, the British, and the role of the individual morally to change that. Now, the fellow on your left here is a fellow who actually, behind the scenes, set a lot of the policies through the 50s. He's tied to Burton Russell, zero growth, anti-technology, population reduction. His name is Albert Wohlstetter, W-O-H-L-S-T-E-T-T-E-R. And he basically runs the discussions and leads the fight on non-proliferation, that you can't have this kind of expansion of nuclear power around the world, makes the case that it's not going to serve any purpose anyway, that the benefits of this kind of energy is overplayed. And he's really the basis on which you have this whole neocon operation built. People like later on Pearl comes in, Wolfowitz, you know, some of these names are more public. You know, this guy always remained behind the scenes. I guess yeah, it would help, yeah. Rather than going through just a lot of the quotes and things, if you look on our site, both the EIR site, if people have subscriptions to it, there's an archive that comes with a subscription that allows you to go back all the way to 1978 when we started the EIR, and you basically have a search capability of pulling up any of these old documents, like this one, Henry Jackson and his role for the British Empire on the Democrat side. Or when I used a lot on this one, the neocons, that Carter killed the nuclear energy program. So the tools on our site to actually get the background and the depth of how this thing works, the ins and outs of who are the players, There's a lot of material I've laid up here in terms of looking at some of these specific cases. How do you figure these out? And the crucial thing here is if you look at this in the 50s, Eisenhower leaves then his administration not only warning of this military-industrial complex. You do have a Kennedy come in the 60s. He's pushing, N.A.W.A.P.A. He's pushing the nuclear program. He's in an alliance with the nations around the world, and is immediately taken out. And so you move through this kind of dynamic of an orientation for development, and then you have this undertow that is these old British Anglo networks that are used to actually sabotage this. And in these particular cases, they not only hit Kennedy, but they were, to this day, are still effectively covering up the actual discussion and operations. So as we watch these films, I want you to keep in mind, the first one is 1976. If you look at these kinds of developments coming through the 70s, you have the leaving of the gold standard in 71. You have the 74 oil hoax. There's a wrecking operation in the 68 convention. Just jumping around, there's all these dynamics that are going on, and really there's not a political force in the world actually calling out this British operation that was really in place coming out of the war. It never got touched in the Nuremberg trials and whatever. So the first film I want to show is Lyndon LaRouche actually having stepped on the scene in 71, laying out the crash, laying out that we've got to deal with this new fascism that's being set up. Lyndon LaRouche jumps into the election in 1976, and what you'll see is the first 8 minutes here of his speech, laying out this this dynamic that's coming to a head now with a weak president, created President Carter, and the forces like Brzezinski and others that are part of that, and the danger of war and the collapse. So why don't we watch that, and then
this was nationwide TV.
right.
On behalf of the Labour Party, but on behalf of many concerned Republicans, many concerned Democrats, and many concerned European leaders, we are convinced, not only me, my party, but key Republicans, key Democrats, key leaders in Europe, key leaders of the Third World, that the election of Jimmy Carter to President of the United States on November 2nd would mean that the United States was, to all intents and purposes, irreversibly committed to thermonuclear war no later than the summer of 1977. Tonight, I shall indicate to you the basic facts upon which we premise that conclusion. And I shall also, of course, tell you in some detail exactly how you can prevent this from occurring. There are two dominant tendencies in present U.S. foreign policy. Carter represents one of those tendencies, or his advisors represent one of those tendencies. Because the world is in a monetary crisis, that is, because the monetary system constructed at the end of World War II is now collapsing. The case of Italy, the case of Britain, the collapse of the euro bond market, of the euro dollar market, the fact that 17, perhaps 20 developing sector nations are now in default on their international debts. The fact that there is no confidence in the international monetary system. Certain forces within the United States are committed to attempting to save this bankrupt monetary system. The methods to which they are resorting are consciously modeled upon those used earlier by Jalnachak, the Nazi finance minister, particularly during the 1933-36 period. That is, they are resorting to methods of extreme austerity, auto-cannibalistic austerity, in the effort to squeeze out of real incomes, of essential social services, and out of the capital of industry itself sufficient wealth to roll over for at least a time some of the bankrupt debt holdings of certain financial interests. These measures are bad enough in the advanced sector. They're bad enough in the United States. We see in New York City what this leads to. They're bad enough in Western Europe and Japan. But in the developing sector, these measures mean genocide. George Ball is very explicit on this in his current book, Diplomacy for a Crowded World. Ball proposes that because he sees certain things which could solve these problems as being unlikely, that we must resort to what he calls triage. That is, we must decide what portion of the present world's population must die and manage food supplies and development in such a way as to determine who dies and who lives. This is also the policy of William Paddock, who Ball cites as authority in part for his point of view. Ball, of course, is a key Carter advisor, Carter's shadow Secretary of State, a former Secretary of State with the Kennedy administration. Now, Ball illustrates his policy and Carter's policy by citing the case of Mexico. Ball endorses Paddock's proposal to reduce the population of Mexico, our neighbor, from 58 million to 28 million. He proposes to do this, and Paddock is very explicit on it, by the method used by Hitler in eliminating 6 million Jews and Slavs and others in Eastern Europe during the war, by a forced, labor-intensive slave labor system in which those who are no longer suitable for this process of slave labor will be allowed to die. They use the word triage to describe this process of allowing the useless eaters to die.
In an interview on January 6th, William Paddock, the author of Famine 1975, said, "We're going to clamp the borders between the U.S. and Mexico down, then watch them scream. There is nothing that really could be done with them. Mexico cannot support its present population on a stable basis. The population will have to be cut to 30 million people."
That's the policy of Ball. That's the policy behind Kissinger's foreign policy. It's the policy behind the dominant group of the United States. Now, obviously, such a policy cannot be imposed upon the developing sector by the will of the people of that sector. People in New York City may put up with this sort of thing, but the people in the developing sector will not in general tolerate. Therefore, it's obvious that what Ball proposes, what other Carter backers proposes, what Kissinger also proposes, what Bill Simon, the Treasury Secretary, proposes, cannot be imposed by the consent of the people of the developing sector. Now, we have the case of Chile, where we have very bad governments who are willing to impose dictatorship, brutal dictatorship, to impose economic austerity. That was the reason for the Chilean coup. But you cannot find any significant constituency in any part of the developing sector which is willing to impose genocide upon its own people. Now, people like Ball and other Carter advisors know this. They know that the developing sector cannot be induced to accept genocide as a policy for its own people without external military force, military influence control. So what they propose to do is to put the developing sector under effectively NATO military and political control. That is, to place the developing sector under conditions of limited sovereignty, and an example of this is the proposed South Atlantic Treaty Organization involving the racist, genocidal Union of South African government and other governments in the region. That's the key to the Kissinger policy for Africa. Now, Kissinger and some others recognize that such a policy, putting most of the developing sector under this kind of NATO sovereignty, means war with the Soviet Union. Kissinger believes, or at least he has espoused the belief, that such war can be avoided by forcing the Soviet Union to successfully back down through bluffing. Now, the problem with Kissinger's policy, and this is where the immediate war danger arises, is that Kissinger is like a poker player sitting with a dead hand of cards with mirrors behind his back trying to bluff his opponent. Everyone in NATO, who I've spoken to, and the Soviets as well, know that this time, that if the United States and NATO were to be involved in either a conventional war, a limited nuclear war, or a thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union, NATO would be defeated. That was the substance of General Brown's briefing some months ago. And that was one of the reasons why certain people tried to get rid of Brown by Watergating him, because he represented a voice of sanity in this connection. He did not wish the United States to get involved in confrontations where the United States might be destroyed as a result of recklessness of people like Hitler. Now, some people, obviously, realizing that Henry Kissinger's policy of bluff is not going to work, are thinking in terms of how to fight a thermonuclear war. That is, recognizing that the policy of imposed genocide upon the developing sector means world war, rather than give up the policy, they propose to discover how to fight war. Then we have people like Paul Nitze in this category. Paul Nitze is a man who was run out of the Eisenhower administration in 1954 because Eisenhower, a competent general, realized what this maniac was. Now, Nitze, in the January 1976 Foreign Affairs, writes an article which, while it's a more or less popularized article, nonetheless represents the estimation of strategic balance as seen by Nitze and many others. As a matter of fact, it's rather optimistic by contrast with what many people think is the case. Nitze states, in effect, that by the end of 1977, or the beginning of 1978, the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, will be at such a decisive strategic advantage with respect to NATO and the United States that the United States would be defeated in a war. There are some people who think that the United States will be defeated now, and that's probably correct. Therefore, Nitze and others who accept the policy of genocide in the developing sector say we must go to war before that change in strategic balance occurs. And that means going to war by the summer of 1977.
In his Foreign Affairs article, Nitze stated, if in 1970 the Soviets had attacked U.S. forces, their entire pre-war advantage would have been eliminated, leaving the United States with substantial superiority at the end of the exchange. However, this situation began to be reversed in 1973, with the Soviets gaining the military capability to end an exchange with an advantage in their favor. By 1977, after a Soviet-initiated counterforce strike against the United States, to which the United States responded with a counterforce strike, the Soviet Union would have remaining forces sufficient to destroy Chinese and European NATO nuclear capability, attack U.S. population and conventional military targets, and still have a remaining force throw weight in excess of that of the United States. And after 1977, the Soviet advantage after the assumed attack mounts rapidly. Nitze underscored his point in a letter to the Washington Post 2 days ago. Nitze wrote, a fundamental point in Henry Kissinger's defense of SALT agreements has been that, in our time, war between major powers is unthinkable. It could be that war between major powers is thinkable, but if so, we should think about it carefully, consistently, and with all the foresight and prudence of which we are capable.
That's what these people are committed to. I've given it to you in brief, but what I've said to you is the essential thinking
So is this kind of analysis that, and then also the programmatic solution to this with economic development that caused, prior to this period and also in the course of this, hundreds and thousands of people to join with LaRouche across the There might be a little bit more on there.
No.
Okay, that's all right. But from LaRouche's analysis on the breakdown crisis in '71, the organization started growing and building. You have a situation where the intervention on this level, where you look precisely at these layers playing the dynamics, and as individual citizens you get understanding how they work and where you have a role to play to break it. And there's another short slug here of this same speech in the rest of the discussion here. This was aired 76 nationwide TV to intervene and make sure that we wreck this Brzezinski role, as I said earlier, with Carter. And there was a number of factions we created that actually were part of that presentation, Carter's former advisor and others. But at the end of the speech here, Lynn goes into what a vote in 1976 for him would mean in terms of defining the situation at this higher level. How would you pull the kind of alliance we have to pull together today of Democrats, Republicans, labor, industry, other constituents around a policy with other nations that actually lay the basis to win this? And again, as you watch this, you're now in 2017 looking from the BRICS arrangement, looking back at this. Watch this next period, this discussion by them.
During the Democratic Party machine, it will also encourage the kind of mainstream Republicans who are being blocked out from access to President Ford at this time. These combined forces, U.S. Labor Party, honest anti-Carter Democrats, and mainstream Republicans, represent 70% or more of the electorate in this country. Now, we have many disagreements among ourselves, these three forces. Nonetheless, we are agreed that Carter must not get into the White House, because that would mean thermonuclear war and similar horrors. We are agreed that we must not go to war. We are agreed that this monetary crisis must be solved. We are agreed to the American traditions of technological progress, of industrial expansion, and agricultural development on a basis on full employment through those policies. Now, with 70% of the electorate mobilized, we can force Henry Kissinger out of the White House. It won't take much effort once Ford sees that he's got that kind of backing for that purpose. We'll get rid of Edward Levy, the man who's trying to subvert the U.S. Constitution out of the Attorney General's office. We'll get a combination in the executive branch and in the Congress, which will get this nation safely through the coming period. That would be the effect of your voting for me. I have other things to do besides this role. Through my efforts and those of my associates over the recent period, the recent months, key forces within the developing sector, governing forces or major political forces otherwise, industrialists, financiers, in Western Europe, the United States, the developing sector, have come to recognize a proposal which I developed called the International Development Bank as the only alternative proposal now of confidence, now on the table, to replace a bankrupt monetary system. The situation is such that if the President of the United States were to say on any Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday that this nation is committed to developing a new monetary system along the lines of the International Development Proposal, the overwhelming majority of the developing sector would immediately accept his proposal, that most of the governments of Europe, and I believe also the government of Japan, would accept that proposal immediately. Under those conditions, under such a statement from Ford, or from a statement of anyone in the White House, we would have a new monetary system. We would not have the depression which is otherwise virtually inevitable, the economic collapse, otherwise virtually inevitable to occur by about Christmas. We would enter a period of the greatest prosperity in modern history. I'll just give you a few facts about it to indicate what's involved. It is my estimation that the agreements which would be reached under my proposal among various nations, this would involve the Comecon as well as Western Europe, the United States, and the developing sector, would involve about $300 billion a year of long-term credits created by treaty agreement to cause the flow of increased industrial production into viable development projects of agriculture, industry, and infrastructure in the developing sector. Feasible projects to this end are already well defined. It is merely necessary to create and channel the credit required to expand our capacity or utilization of capacity in Western Europe, the United States, Japan, and so forth, in order to make these things go. Of this $300 billion I've estimated, approximately $100 billion of this long-term credit will be an increased annual output of industrial exports to the United States alone. Furthermore, the putting in of approximately $300 billion a year into this kind of long-term industrial and agricultural development will have side effects. That is, that the increase in global industrial production will go way ahead of $300 billion a year as a result of secondary effects. That would mean that in this nation, we would turn around from industrial decay, enter a period of high capital formation, with full utilization of our idle productive capacity, industrial productive capacity, with expansion of that capacity, with modernization of that capacity, and with jobs representing increasing skill levels available to a greater number of our population. And with the tax revenues available to the federal government, on the basis of that expansion, we would be able to meet the needs of our population. Without such a program, no one can meet those needs. You cannot keep a population in prosperity by trying to recarve a shrinking pie. Without a new monetary system, without major sources of new credit to revitalize industrial production, without credit to establish the markets in the developing sector necessary to revitalize that production, the United States is going into the worst depression in all history. But if we create those credits, then we're going to have the greatest prosperity in all history. Furthermore, if we establish such a monetary system, then the basic cause for the danger of war is eliminated. Now, what time is required in this country for people to fight this out? A new monetary system involves debt moratoria and other measures. People are very unhappy and very upset about this. They need time, perhaps, to straighten this out. I think that if you vote for me, give me a large enough vote, enough leverage, that we can prevent Carter's advisors from imposing their policy, leading us toward war, and we'll have the time and margin to fight out among mainstream Republicans, honest anti-Carter Democrats, and Labor Party supporters to fight out rationally the measures to be taken to realize this new monetary system. This is Lyndon LaRouche. Thank you.
So obviously, Carter wasn't stopped, but we did actually create the conditions under Lynn's leadership, both domestically and internationally, to break their ability to pull it off. And what's happening, as you referenced literally or briefly, internationally had people like Fred Wills, Indira Gandhi, 76, same period, the non-aligned movement, nations that weren't allied with the Comecon in Russia or to the United States and NATO. The non-aligned movement was a separate entity back there. And Fred Wills, for example, former foreign minister and finance minister of Guyana, actually read Lynn's proposal into the United Nations at one point. So this was breaking in a very crucial manner. I don't know if you can see that. You have it up there, right? You have this kind of a famous picture that kind of says a lot just in and of itself in terms of there's a knowledge that Lyndon LaRouche exists, although from the media, it's not known a whole lot. But Lynn in this particular situation is New Hampshire, 1980, and they had everybody running for president in New Hampshire sitting in one large, gun control event. So everybody from the town guy who was saying, I want to run for president, to the Democrats, to the Republicans, to every candidate. It wasn't like, so L comes right next to R in the people. So Lyndon LaRouche sat next to Ronnie Reagan for about 2.5 to 3 or 4 hours, whatever the length of that debate. And they actually hit it off. This is when they first met. And so in addition to Lynn giving Ronald Reagan a lot of strategy in New Hampshire of how to take on Bush, how to go after the Trilateral Commission, how to shake some of these things up. And I was in New Hampshire at the time. Some of the biggest deployers of LaRouche material in Dover and other places in the state, I was working in Dover, was the Reagan networks going after Bush. So in addition to how to fight that and how to take it on and not capitulate it to, and then especially discussion on the Strategic Defense Initiative, how this thing would work. So at the end of the campaign, Reagan did beat out Bush, who was scheduled to win. They manipulated him again to take on Bush and later on. But this arrangement and alliance actually was really then grounded when Reagan and his staff invited Lynn in to actually discuss the SDI, which became then law, as people know bits and pieces about it you can look at. So this was in 80, 83, 84. 84, we put 15 half-hour shows on nationwide television in all across the nation, half-hour shows. By 84, we're taking 23, 32% in Minnesota, just a lot of candidates. By 86, we win not only Illinois, and the media went nuts, saying that this was a fluke, and they slammed that back in line. But that same fluke happened the following month here in Texas when Claude Jones won the Democratic county chairmanship here. So this was something they had to.
What year was that again?
It was 86. 86. We won in March. I'm sorry?
88.
Claude was in 88? Yeah.
We won in 86 in Illinois.
Yeah. We won in 80. I thought it was the next month.
Yeah, I think it was 86.
Yeah, I think it was the very next month.
88 was Claude Jones.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. But anyway, this is the kind of breakout that was occurring. And then by 88, you have Lynn going to jail on these trumped up charges.
Sure.
So the question here, and why I'm going through the history of this, is what in the world can create and run that kind of operation in the United States exactly like they're doing it today? Because if you look at Lynn's discussion, you know, the Paddocks and all these, you got the same Mnuchins and various people today. You got the whole structure. You've got, this is what we're up against. And the knowledge of how this works, first who it is historically, and then the quality of mind that you need to take it on. Where does the courage come to take this up and fight it, as opposed to capitulate like you see in terms of the blackmail and the pressure, whatever's going on. So how do we as citizens actually take that on? So this was Lyndon LaRouche in 1976, building on what he had laid it in building the whole organization. And what he laid out in a discussion in 78 is that if you look at this empire, this the secrets known only to the inner elites, how this works, but anybody can know it, is that they manipulate and control things by this geopolitics, playing everybody against each other. They control it by their control of credit. There's no credit outside their structures, and they'll bust anybody who attempts to move on that. And then also this ability to manipulate people's perceived interest. What's your real interest as a nation or an individual? What's your perceived interest? And how do they play corruption in people and get the willful situation to go along with, whether you're talking nations or whether you're talking individuals. And so to get to this history of this, so we have a clear picture, I went also back to another discussion by Lynn, and it's a presentation on the black wealth and the evil of the black wealth and how this thing works. So it's a little longer, it's about 10 or 12 minutes. But I think it's the best way to get a sense
from over the course of the 12th and 13th century into the 14th century.
Yeah, left up the little
like
A foot.
Was not intended to start.
I'm sorry.
Do you want to say what the wealth? I don't know what black wealth is.
Well, it's one of the factions in these international oligarchies. That it's an extension. I mean, people know the Roman Empire when it collapsed. You know, it basically moves out of one place to make just kind of a sweep, moves into Venice, and through Venice they control the seas and the manipulations and the money control. Part of that, the reason I didn't go through that, he'll develop some of it. You know, that,
It's a family name.
right, it's
What was the family?
one of the families, yeah.
Well,
Oh,
And so as he'll develop how this moves then out of that situation up into first, you know, the Dutch situation, Amsterdam, and then into London, where they get a broader control of as the world's changing, and how do they deal with something like the Renaissance, because it's breaking out of their control.
What year is this?
He's starting at the 1200s, but it's basically laying the dynamics around the crash that also created the Black Death, this kind of breakdown crisis. I just thought I'd let Lynn go through the details on this, and we can take up some of the specifics.
what year is that presentation, that picture?
This is 2005
Okay.
at a national conference. I'm sorry, I thought I.
From over the course of the 12th and 13th century into the 14th century, a form of evil which is directly traced by the Venetians themselves to the ancient Canaanite city of Tyre had arisen to great power in the north of the Adriatic Sea, the city of Venice, which has been in recent time, until he moved to London, the residence of Satan on earth. These people great power. They built a maritime power in the image of ancient Phoenicia, which is Canaan. Phoenicia is a Greek word. The people of that region were called the Canaanites. And the center of evil was Tyre. Tyre was destroyed by a great man, Alexander the Great. But the principle of Tyre lived on. And it came through the Roman Empire, it came to reside in Venice. And from about 800 AD on, Venice was an increasing power in the Mediterranean. It became a great sea power, which became a dictatorship over the Mediterranean over the period from the course of the 12th century into the beginning of the 13th century, with the so-called Fourth Crusade. And I can tell you all the Crusades were frauds. They were all run by the Venetians. Nothing to do with Christianity, they had to do with something else. The Fourth Crusade was organized by Venice to conquer and loot Byzantium, which is its major competitor. And the Latin Empire in Byzantium was set up from 1204 to 1261, when a fellow called Michael Palaeon overthrew it on behalf of the Greeks. But Venice became a great looting power. It crushed every element of civilization. It imposed evil cults. It spread the cult of Aristotle throughout the Mediterranean and other cults. It looted everything. It imposed its debt every place. It manipulated nations into making war on one another. They weren't real nations, but they were whatever passed were at that time. They plunged Europe into war and usury and looting and bestiality and cruelty. And nothing could seem to stop it. The political institutions of Europe collapsed at about 1250, or over the period 1250 to 1267, in a series of wars. A leading figure of the late 13th century and early 14th century, Dante Alighieri, typified those who fought desperately to save civilization from this pestilence of Venice and the Venetians' Mongol allies, who are attacking Europe from the west, from the east. Venice's power grew. Dante was probably murdered by the Venetians after a trip into Venice and its area. The ideas of Dante lived on through various networks. Not only Dante, but there were great Franciscans and others who continued the tradition, the Augustinian tradition, and developed it then as before. Then in the middle of the century, the 14th century, the whole system collapsed in a chain reaction of bankruptcy, starting with the King of England discovering, by checking with his priest, that not only was usury a mortal sin, but that he, as the King of England, by continuing to pay his debts to usury, was actually contributing to the eternal damnation of the soul of his creditors. So the King of England repudiated his debts to the houses of Bardi and Peruzzi, which were Florentine-based, but they were key bankers of the period, who had looted every part of Europe through this bank. It's pretty much like the IMF conditionalities today. As a matter of fact, the IMF conditionalities are a repetition, a continuation of the Venetian tradition. They are evil. The people who run the IMF are evil. The bureaucrats of the IMF as a collectivity are purely evil. They are mass murderers. They have already killed far more people on this planet than Adolf Hitler succeeded in doing. They are wiping out the people of developing countries. What they've contributed to with their English masters, including Linda Chaka, who is the colonial minister, they call it overseas development now, but she's really the colonial minister from the House of Lords, who was given to us by Lady Thatcher, who is reputed to be a witch because she succeeded in transforming a merely bankrupt England into a rubbish heap. And also because of the way she handled her pet cat, George Bush. Who, by the way, is no friend of mine. So these people were crushed, and their political power was crushed by their bankruptcy. There's an analogy today. I'm not Plutarch, and I'm not a priest of the cult of Apollo, as he was, but comparisons are sometimes permitted. Today, as then, in the middle of the 14th century, the new Venetian Empire, which is the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, or whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing, is based on financial power. All finance and monetary systems today are divorced entirely from trade and production. They're engaged in pure speculation, in usury, debt as a form of usury, the looting of countries, of whole regions of the world, the power of the ruling oligarchy, which are like Venetian families, Ford Foundation, this foundation, that foundation. This is what runs the United States, not the government. This is what runs the world, not the governments. The governments are run by these powerful families and their oligarchical connections, who control the Washington Post. They control the New York Times. They control the 3 TV networks. They control Jane Fonda. She might not admit it, but she's a real right-wing fascist. They are looting the world. They have great power. People are afraid of them. They're afraid of the press. The Congress is afraid of the press. The Justice Department is controlled by these families. Everything is rotten. It's controlled by these families. People say, be smart. Don't get into trouble. Don't attack them. Don't attack the Queen of England. How can you not attack her? She's killing all those people. You're going to keep quiet about it? What, are you going to involve in misprision of a felony by not attacking the Queen of England? So the time has come, we say, well, what if these people suddenly lose their financial power? What if these banks go bankrupt? What if the IMF is liquidated? What if the international monetary institutions don't function? What if there's no facility by which these institutions can exert?
What year was that again?
2005.
Lyndon just gotten out of prison, right?
Oh,
No, he got out of prison, right?
94.
Oh, no.
No. He was in 2008 to 94. Yeah. From 88, 1988 to
Yeah,
88.
Oh, yeah.
Was that the end of it?
That was the end of that.
All right.
Yeah, it was January of '89.
Then he got out.
Yeah, no, that he was put in jail, and then he got out in,
I'm like 10 years off.
94.
I'm 10 years off.
So if you look at this grouping, the speculation that he refers to, and if you look at you say, how have they gotten away with this as long as they have? Well, look at as one person, former member, asked Lynn in front of me one time, he says, well, Lynn, how can they get away with this so long? And he says, well, you have to look, and this was back in the 80s. Lynn says, you have to look that there was so much in the United States to loot. The education system, the health system, you name it. And you look at the results of that now.
And the pension funds.
Pension funds, you name it. You know, the lack of investment, all these things that were costs that we should have incurred that weren't done, they went into these houses. So you look at the rate at which they moved into the derivative bubbles and the bailouts, the bail-ins, the bailouts. I mean, 85 billion a month for a while, $1 trillion a year, right? So as we've laid out in various ways, you look at China, that in the last period has invested $10 trillion into these kinds of infrastructure projects and have lifted 800 billion people out of poverty in China and now in Africa, whatever. And you look at the United States and this Anglo, the trilateral network, the Japan, Europe, and the United States, close to 15 trillion. And what do we have for it? Well, you have a faster and faster blowing out bubble. We're now at that point. This is going to blow. The question is, as much as we have a scrapper in the president, President Trump, who has, with his tweets and whatever, he's fought this, and the step beyond what he's gone is to actually name this, bring in LaRouche's 4 laws, and actually move decisively to crush this. But you have to do it at this higher level. You got to fight it at the level of the British Empire and have LaRouche's credit policy and vector credit in place, so you could actually put them through a bankruptcy, let them go under and not go under with them. And that fight is now on the table, as Helga laid out. They are in a desperate move to wreck this presidency, cause this war, create the conditions where they think they can reorganize the paper and stay on top. And their operations have worked up to this point, as I said in the intro, the invitation I sent out, but no longer now, because a couple of years ago, the Chinese adopted this policy. If you look at the kinds of things I said earlier, Fred Wills of Guyana, the Indira Gandhis, all these layers that, you know, started moving and then got hit, like Indira Gandhi and others. Lynn, uniquely, with a 40-year track record on this, stands out here still in a position for people to grab his hand, as he said in the last slug there in 76. So the quality that we as individuals have to look at this, and you can see with the kind of dynamic and the humor and everything else of Lyndon LaRouche, why a certain percentage of the population, grabbed onto his leadership, has been fighting for years and decades to master that. We've had a lot of people join, and this fight goes on in terms of the enemy running operations to pick it off. But this fight that was coming to a head in the 80s, and then got wrecked with both the assassination operations on Reagan, Lynn going to jail, breaking up a lot of the impact. We really have, it's a totally different situation on the table now, where this enemy has never been this vulnerable in the entire history that Lynn has laid out. So what I wanted to do before we open it up for questions is play one last ending section.
Can you explain the slide that was behind you? Go over there.
Yeah, we've had this up before. This is an estimate, I forget what year, trillions of dollars, 708 trillion in various derivatives, and as opposed to the, you have the GDP?
Yeah.
Like here's the GDP of the United States at 15 trillion.
Where did that figure come from? And could you briefly explain what a derivative is?
Good luck with that.
The derivative is one of these.
You play poker?
It's a creation of money. I mean, people know it by various kinds of futures and various things that don't really exist. You're betting on aspects of a piece of paper, or you look for.
Well, futures are based on the growth of plants and pork bellies and stuff like that.
Yeah, tied, like Lynn said earlier, tied to a productive economy. What you have is basically a substitution for that physical economy, a substitution of various kinds of papers. For example, Lincoln built the transcontinental railroads, and the nation mushroomed immediately, had rail lines going all over the place. Chicago, for example, went in 20 years in 1848, no rail, to 20 years later in 1869 had 65 no, actually 96 passenger trains a day, not even the freight trains. 20 years, it just exploded. Now what happened is these Wall Street networks bought up a number of those rail lines, took them over, didn't put so much into maintaining the rail as a physical delivery system, but created a stock market that had been going before that, but where you sell dividends into these kinds of operations. So they can, rather than putting money into infrastructure and maintaining the rail, they put it in the form of stocks and they create a paper on the physical economy. In many cases, they ran the stocks up and basically bankrupted the railroad in the process. So these derivatives off of a function that's going on. Another example that Lynn used in the past, if you go to a corner, there's a crap game going on in the corner, and people are trying to bet on whether you're going to make your roll of the dice or not. And then there's a person standing on the side taking a second bet. He's not rolling the dice, but he's saying, well, I've got 50 bucks that says he makes it or not. So you have derivatives off of the primary operation, especially there are various paper structures, especially now it doesn't even include really physical economy. So you have like
paper.
Yeah, like the bailouts and the bailout. We're pumping this kind of money in where the United States taxpayer is buying this gambling debt off the bankers' books and putting it on the taxpayer obligations.
Is that through the Federal Reserve? Or?
A good portion of it. There's other venues also.
So, and where did that figure come from? 700.
So that I think was from the Bank of International Settlements.
Right.
Yeah, that was from the Bank of International Settlements report. But the movie that discusses the 2008 crash, what was that movie called?
The Big Short.
The Big Short. That explains derivatives pretty well.
Now, if you compare that to what at the time, $15 trillion in GDP, which is kind of a loose figure anyway, but the whole world economy at that same point was measured at 45 trillion. So this is what they're looting the physical economy to keep propping this up and actually expanding it. So what Lynn's 4 laws would do is not only separate these two types of banking with Glass-Steagall, it would immediately set this off the books as never been real in the first place as a gambling debt, and massively invest with this credit policy into rebuilding the physical economy like the Chinese are doing today on the American system, basically.
So, but these are just bets against. So it's actually the paper doesn't even exist, right? It's just like deriving off of bets, off of bets, off of bets.
Right.
So basically, there's no assets that are literally backing up.
Not anymore.
Paper or physical.
Yeah, the derivative is a financial instrument that is highly leveraged by the banks.
Right.
So instead of having, right, a certain reserve of money in the bank and capital in the bank, right, it's using these derivative, right, swaps. What are they called?
Credit default swaps.
Credit default swaps, right? And
Yeah, all these things.
yeah, so all these things are as they said in that movie, it's a big pile of shit.
See, a good way to look at it is think of a gambling casino and what's its relationship to society. It really has no relationship. But you have these guys basically saying the money we create and we make and whatever, and all the chips on the gambling casino can be used like you take your Monopoly game and you go out and you want to spend it as real money. Now, we're at a point, like the 14th century in the Bordi-Peruzzi blowout, that you're beyond any way to fix this because you've so looted the physical economy, as you can see in New York, the breakdown of the standard of living. You're now at a point, like in the Nazi situation, where you're also turning it into looting it out, literally out of the backs of people with the slave labor. And that's been the policy of this faction all along. The Queen's policy and the British policy of population reduction. We got to.
But this is world banks, not just U.S. banks. So that's 700.
Well, they're now all together. There are no such thing. There is no such thing as an American currency at this point. It's tied to these, the oil monies and the drug monies and whatever. The only way you can do that is put through Glass-Steagall, make this separation, and get back in control of your own credit. Now, that's what we've got to create the conditions where Trump takes that next step. He's got to go with LaRouche's, credit system. He's got to put through that second step of the Hamiltonian system and then tie the credit into these projects that are big enough and broad enough to be able to turn around the whole system, psychologically, politically, and economically. Now, that's why Helga laid out what she's laying out, that we're now at a point to block that because the world is moving on Lynn's policy. You've got to break out in the United States toward these policies. That, as Lynn said, what if those banks go under? Well, you've got to have an alternative in place. So you can't just put through Glass-Steagall saying bankrupt it, well, then you go under with it. You've got to have the whole 4 laws in a package. And this is where all of us come into play here. To the degree we know a bit about this, at least we know and have access to where to go to get the solutions and get an understanding of who the enemy is. We have the unique role of being visible and causing that to change. And there's all kinds of backup in this office and on the website and the tools, like I was saying earlier, to reinforce and back up people to do that. But really what we now do to break that wide open is crucial. And that's, if people haven't watched it, that's
what was that German bank, the Deutsche Bank, that had a run on their, they were on like a week-to-week basis just trying to have enough money to cover their bad derivative.
Yeah, but it's not an exception, it's the whole system.
Yeah.
Now, what I'd like to do before it gets too late, and then I just stick it at the end, we don't have time to discuss what Lynn lays out in this next period. There's a little, I think, 7-minute piece here at the end. Again, it's the same conference from 2005, and he takes up this question of how do you face this enemy, what we've now seen kind of in a schema, but where does the courage come from to actually take that on, and then we can elaborate more how we effectively do that as an organization.
The enemy has to be defined properly. Who is the enemy? Well, Cheney is ready for the rubbish bin. He could go quickly. He's earned it. I mean, the Lautenbach report, Lautenbach-Waxman report on the way he's ripped off the American budget, the American till, with his aid of his Halliburton associates, and how he has profited by what Halliburton has done by the way of the steel business, is really puts him in jeopardy. He's not a popular guy. He's hated. Unfortunately, he's also feared, and cowards fear him. But the enemy is not Cheney. Cheney is only a tool, as his wife describes him. The enemy is the Venetian faction. What the problem today in economy, which has to be addressed, and this is where Democrats lose their nerve. In the Senate and elsewhere, they lose their nerve. And it's not that they don't lack inspiring causes to go to, but when they know and they are informed by people like Felix Wahab and so forth, that they are treading in dangerous waters, which they might not like to find themselves in, they wince. The biggest of what we have is the defection of Republicans from the Republican cause. Not the Republican Party as such, but from what the neocons represent in the Republican Party. So you have a mass defection of Republicans who cannot support what stinks. But you don't have Democrats, and with a few exceptions, who are stepping up to the plate, as it is said, on issues, because they're afraid of what? They're afraid of the financial interests. We have to realize that the enemy of humanity today is the same enemy that Franklin Roosevelt had when he was alive, which sometimes we call the bankers, but he didn't think of the bankers, he had it right. He understood that the financial oligarchy including the grandfather of the present president, Prescott Bush, have been the authors of funding Hitler's being put into power in Germany. That these people in the American oligarchy, the Wall Street oligarchy, the backers of Coolidge, the controllers of Hoover, these were the people who had put Hitler into power and Mussolini before him and Franco after him. These were the people who were prepared to support Hitler all the way and his system if he had only gone eastward first against the Soviet Union rather than against France and England. They turned against Hitler. Many of them didn't turn until 1940, but they began to turn against Hitler when it was learned the German military was prepared to strike westward first before striking eastward. So they became anti-Hitler because they didn't like his direction. They liked his methods, but not his direction. And they supported him by bringing fascism, Nazism into power in Germany, and fascism into power throughout continental Europe. Now you have to understand then, you have to go back deeper, that fascism, Nazism, which is largely a product of a group known as the Syndicus International. It's a group of bankers in the Venetian tradition. These are independent family banks, family financial interests, which cluster like a slime ball together and have individuality, but they also are a slime. Okay? This is the problem. These guys have come to the point where since 1939, when there was no longer, since there was no longer a Soviet Union as a contender, they felt free to destroy Western Europe and the Americas because they no longer needed Western Europe and the Americas as an economic and military strength to control the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union was gone, they said, history has ended, as Francis Fukuyama put it. History is now at an end. Now the empire can return. Now the empire means the Venetian model, which means the British model, it means the Anglo-Dutch liberal model, under which, in their view, the nation state either should not exist, and they intend to eliminate most nation states, which is what the real purpose was in Iraq, not to defeat, as I would say, was to destroy Iraq, which they're doing. Their intent is to destroy Syria. Their intent is to destroy Iran. Their intent is to destroy Israel. The intent is to destroy every part of that region in the world and beyond. And they call them failed states. You know, why does it fail? Because it got killed. That's why it failed. Then what about the other states? Well, they do not want to tolerate in Europe or in the United States a government which does not submit to the power of a financial oligarchy. Now, what these guys are up against is, like which Felix Verhagen really typifies, is they represent a financier oligarchy which says clusters of these bankers are going to run the world and no government will challenge the authority of these bankers, of their money. That's what the issue is. And they not only use the threat of financial campaigns against politicians and their constituencies, they also kill. They commit murders. They murder officials. They murdered Kennedy. They murdered McKinley. They murdered other people. En masse. They are killers. They don't do it personally, generally. They give the orders. And they can find Nazi types like the Pinochet types and so forth who will go out and carry out those orders. That's the way it's done. So there is a genuine fear of these bankers or these financier interests among people who know that they hire killers. Most of the assassinations of the world are run, orchestrated by these financial agencies. They kill. They are poisonous cockroaches in our system. inhabiting the pores of our system. And that's what the problem is. People are afraid of it. Again, the answer, as I said just a while ago, the answer is if you don't have a sense of immortality, of an immortal interest in your life, you don't have the source of courage to make the kinds of decisions that challenge power, evil like that. What they represent, what Felix Wahaupan typifies in his own small way, is Satan. You want a figure for Satan? That's him. Not him personally as such, but he typifies what is satanic in society today. This is the evil. And people are afraid to stand up against evil. To say, look, I'm willing to do whatever is possible to reform the society for the better. But look, don't get me in trouble.
One thing, I just close it up. Now, this is Lyndon LaRouche, 1 year after he got out of jail with any number of assassination attempts in jail that were run, that we had a judo. But here's Lynn, again, calling this, as he's called his entire life. Lyndon LaRouche turns 95 in about a month. And I think it's the highest example of what the American tradition was built to be and what now has to be delivered by a lot of us youngsters and older youngsters to pick that up and actually deliver this, because we are in a position to not only move against this bunch with the BRICS arrangement and the crisis they're in and the expose that's coming down, and a president of the United States that's at least interested in these kinds of scraps, if he understands the full fight. We have to deliver that knockout punch. And just to come back to the example of the Eisenhower-Adams for Peace program, in Johnson's administration building all this, there was a point where Eisenhower came in as a former president and hammered out with Johnson a delivery of a desalination program for the Middle East, basically paralleling the one that we have out as the Oasis Plan of LaRouche. And not only did the Wolfowitzes and the Wostetters and all these characters, wreck that, but as it's coming to a head with Ben Gurion and others, you have the 67 Middle East War. And this year is also the 50-year history of that, where those borders have still not been gone back to. And you see how this faction, this British Venetian operation, has been able to control the debate, control the policy, control, and that's what we're on the verge of breaking completely and finishing them. So I'll close it there. We can open up for questions and things, but it's that battle, as Lynn just said. We have to define it correctly, and we have to use the tools to actually eliminate it.
So people should just remember that Robert Mueller, who is running the operation right now, the legal operation against Trump, is the guy that organized the operation to put Lyndon LaRouche in jail. This is the continuity that Ron's talking about here.
That anybody who gets out of line with Wall Street and what Wall Street wants as global policy, they get the same treatment.
The difference is all that operated in secret.
Yeah,
right now it's out front.
Right.
The players are in public. The question is really,
and globally.
If you look at our site, if you look at what we've got historically, the EIR, and what people can have today, reading Lynn's pieces, we have the tools. It's totally in public, and it's in a form at a time when other people can pick it up. It's really, as was brought up in the discussion, it's really how we play that visible role. And that's where you get to the last thing that Lynn says. Where does the courage come from in this fight to actually take it up? Because we are in a position, and we do have to win that fight, but we are in a position to win it. Louise, you had a question?
Yes. So Robert Mueller, what position was he in when he ran the operation against LaRouche and got him into jail?
He was a prosecutor up in the Boston area, operated under a fellow named William Weld, who were part of the whole operation. Initially, they went after Lynn. That case was shut down, when we actually forced the subpoena of Bush's records that would have proved the kind of sabotage. They closed it down, took it down to Virginia, and slammed through a second trial, putting LaRouche in jail under the rocket docket. The irony of the whole situation.
Roanoke, right?
What's that?
Was that Roanoke?
No.
But the irony of the situation is we actually went to court in Boston to force legally that they had to keep the case open against LaRouche, because even the judge said the evidence, even before we put up a defense, just the prosecutor's case was so blatant that they would have thrown it out. And the jurors actually voted publicly. They stated when they were interviewed that this was a real, crime against justice. Same thing with the Virginia one, where Ramsey Clark and other people became a defense lawyer for LaRouche, and actually lays out that this is the most heinous obstruction of justice and constitutional violations that he'd ever seen in his career. He was
So
a
Mueller
former
was a
attorney general.
state prosecutor then?
No, he was federal.
He was a federal,
case.
okay, federal prosecutor.
Yeah.
Okay, and I also wanted to ask you if you could, first of all, the last film we just saw was from 2005?
2005.
Right. But getting back to Wohlstetter, what was his role, and that was in the 1960s, and I mean, he was British. What was his influence?
He was the key mathematical operative in Rand Corporation. He did a lot of the modelings and things that.
But he was British, wasn't he?
I don't know if he was
No, I don't
nationally
think so.
British. I
Oh,
don't
he was
think so.
American.
At MIT or
Yeah.
Stanford or something.
I mean, a good thing again to read on this is we put out a book. It's a series of pamphlets that was put in a book called The Children of Satan. And the first section of that book actually walks people through this whole Leo Strauss Chicago University operation that create what they term as gentlemen that are really running both sides. So when you get down to this left-right fight at the bottom, not everybody understands that they're part of a controlled operation, but you have ideological manipulations of these layers by these higher levels. And Leo Strauss is a protege of Carl Schmitt, who set up the legal structure that gave Hitler dictatorial power in Germany once they ran the Reichstag fire and then locked it up because they had to protect themselves from the communists who did it. Same kind of thing that 9/11 really is, and how they then ran the lockdown off of that. So again, it's looking beyond this particular or that. How do you get to this higher level of what's the actual policy fight going on? And it's
Speaking of it, Mueller was the guy who classified the 28 pages.
right.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, he covered up for the Saudi Arabia.
right.
Yeah,
See, so again, you look at the VIP's report, and you look at these kind of documentations on these people, which we've gotten out everywhere. What's blocking layers from picking this up? Well, it's this bigger operation, these bigger fears. And it's not like people are going up at this point individually by themselves against it. It's like, former Congressman Gallagher said when he took on some of these operations around the assassination of Kennedy and went up against people like Hoover and others. He says, and he took some political brunts and blows for that, but he says, I went at it, I didn't have an army. And he's a collaborator of ours now, that Lynn has actually built an army. So if you look at this was 76, this was 12 years ago, the second film we saw, this is 12 years later. There is no reason for anyone to say, I'm looking for a solution someplace, let me find somebody else, right? It's really now, how do we find the courage to look squarely at the fight, understand that we can defeat this, and take up the fight. And if we do that, in this kind of situation we're in, you'll have the kind of breakout. We're in a mass strike situation where it's on everybody's mind, they have to have a solution, and that's the 4 laws. This bankruptcy of that bubble, the credit policy to have us independent of it, and then the physical developments that the Chinese are already doing. So is that something that we're saying, boy, we have to do this in the future? It's already underway, and the enemy is actually deploying themselves to wreck it, and they're more and more vulnerable because they're desperate in public. What we have to have is the courage to have the knockout punch.
We have to have the courage to qualify to join the Chinese and the Russians and most of the rest of the world with those 4 laws.
And given the nature of the U.S.-Russia relations right now, it would be important to flank them with that investigation of Russiagate.
Yeah.
So we need those 100,000 signatures, right?
Every one of those particulars is part of the fight. The thing is activating ourselves to do it. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Trump's approval rating being in the low 30s, as far as how that's all part of the same thing? Because it seems when he does a rally, it just doesn't seem like that's reality. And how do you think that kind of plays into the whole theme of what we're seeing?
Well, who takes the polls?
Who says?
Right, who forms the questions and how you can actually get a lot of it? But that whole structure is part of the manipulation in terms of creating issues. I mean, how do they do most of the control in the United States? Is not only the control through the parties and Wall Street and money, but single issues. Here's an issue. This is the issue we define in the media. You take a side on the issue, right? But you can't solve anything in a particular issue, right? So the poll is the same kind of. How do you create perceptions? How do you create what people think? And this is unique about Lynn and how he's always approached this. How do you measure the actual dynamic you're living in? Like I said at the beginning, what is your real interest? And this is where the question of immortality comes in. We're all living a certain number of years. Nobody really knows what. But what is going to be the nature of your life? What is really valuable? Now, those higher universal principles is what then governs what you do, what you tolerate, what you're going to,
How you form your opinion.
Yeah.
Right, but my question really is, why do they think that's going to be effective? Because they did that throughout the election. It seems to have the opposite effect. So, they're reporting like it was impossible for him to win the election. And now they're still doing the same strategy, which has failed them. Why are they thinking this is good?
Not very smart.
Because it's having the...
Nobody said they were sane.
But it's also, look, I mean, they're carrying out a coup, and a coup is not based on popular sentiment. To carry out the Kennedy assassination, they had to activate all kinds of operations to create the public image of and incite, hostility against Kennedy.
But at the time, Kennedy was very popular, right?
Yeah, right. And
Not down here.
Well, yeah, but the point is, they had, or the assassination of King. I mean, you have to create a certain environment where an assassination or a coup can succeed. And part of that environment is to create in the minds of even his supporters the idea, well, I may still support him, but there's opposition. The opposition is growing. The opposition is in control, or whatever. So I think the thing you have to realize is this is all part of how they carry out a coup, creating the perception that he doesn't have support. Why do you think they keep, these wild news stories, just unbelievable stories that are on NPR all day long. It saturates the Washington, D.C. environment, saturates the environment of institutional layers. And, it may not have effect on the people who stopped watching the CNN and stopped listening to that news per se, but among the people who actually, like the Congress, that they would continue to operate, in fear, has a lot to do with that. That kind of terror and intimidation, that the power of the media.
Also poses the question why Fox News and all these layers supposedly defend Trump on this issue and that and whatever, but they never move at a level to actually solve the problem.
No, they always say that Russia is the enemy,
right,
and Iran is the enemy, and so China's the enemy. They're still pushing the neocon axioms, even though they're supporting Trump, right?
They're probably are they doing that at an active declaration because they know that the Trump Republicans will pretty much stop watching them so they can still get some of their narrative through just by seemingly supporting the president.
Well,
keep in mind this higher level where they have to deal with the fact that the whole world situation's out of their control. You have Russia, China, layers of 180 nations at least moving on this LaRouche solution.
And Africa is entirely excited. I mean, they're totally excited about what the Chinese have done. So it's
you've got a network in the United States in labor and whatever who used to be able to be manipulated on their perceived interest that you got to fight China because they're going to take our jobs. You have to be scared. A lot of that's breaking down, especially when they realize what's going on with some of these developments and why aren't we doing part of it? Why don't we pick up this 50 billion offer from China and 100 billion to 150 billion from Japan? There's a quality of the human mind that in this kind of a crisis is, if you're not completely, nuts or just a degenerate, that begins to try to think outside the box, consciously or unconsciously. So if it has leadership, it can respond and actually see a solution and get some courage to fight. If it doesn't see that leadership, and that's why they've isolated LaRouche. They got to create a situation that even if somebody figures it out, they say, well, he's got a good idea here or there, but you don't want to be part of that. And they've got the spin. But again, that's part of what's breaking down in this crisis. So a lot of the tools they've had, including the polls, and they'd be able to create all this, that's breaking down. But what's missing is an understanding by the American people of their own role in a solution that is an American system solution. And that's where we as individuals uniquely come in, because we've got the history, we've got Lynn's leadership, we've got a network of people around all of us that if they see a way out of this, they can actually grab it. Now the question is whether they have the courage to grab it. We're in the streets every day. You have people who respond and like it, but is it a durable response? Can you actually build the institution that will be the replacement in this collapse? And that's fairly well established internationally, which is why the British so desperately need a war. And that, again, like I said, that's what Helga lays out uniquely, is we're as close to that war being triggered as we are to actually defeating them and taking it the other direction. And so the fact that people have to step on the stage of world history as an individual and play a role, well, that's the moral choice that's before us all.
What you just said about Helga, he's referring to the webcast last night.
Yeah.
It's about a half hour, on the
LaRouche A.P.A.
LaRouche A.P.A. channel, or go to LaRouche A.P.A. It's really good. In fact, they have a clip. They use the clip from Schumer talking about you're going to fight the intelligence services. How they'll get you 6 ways to Sunday. If you fight them, and it's basically he's saying, look, they're threatening me. That's why I'm an asshole. That's why we're all assholes up here. Because we don't want to fight the intelligence services. They'll get us.
Yeah.
And now they're bragging about.
Yeah, you got John Brennan, the former director of the CIA, right? Then you've got what's his face?
Comey and
Mueller,
Clapper.
That sexually transmitted disease, Clapper.
Ron, you write LaRouche back up there. Is the video still on or not? The camera.
No, we're off, I think.
Oh, okay.
But they are.
I like the slogan they're using in New York, which says, you have to Chuck Schumer.
Yeah, where should we chuck some?
Yeah, where?
Oh,